In these turbulent and terrible times, we need to relax. So what better way to relax than to open a cheap bottle of Prosecco, well, not that cheap, and share it with our esteemed veteran diarist and correspondent, and one of our favourite writers, Mr. Peter Oborne. Here he goes. It's not a Scotch.
What about, would you like some?
I would.
I think ladies
Thank you, Peter.
first, if you know what I mean. I don't think giving it to the...
No, well, I was hoping you'd pass it. And you passed that test. I don't think Peter needs much introduction. He was a senior political commentator, diarist, writer for the Mail, the Telegraph, started the Standard, I think as a business journalist, mainly business. He's been writing for us for about 5 years or so, writes regularly for Middle Eastern Eye, great author of books. And Fate of Abraham was the last one. There's a new one imminent. But before we get to all that publicity and pap, Peter, you, I would say, a little bit older than I am, and I'm older than Hardeep, so it makes you significantly older than Hardeep. Have you ever, in all your decades, and I'm not going to say how many of them there are, experienced such a turbulent time in world affairs?
Well, I think it's the moment we're most like is 1929 is where we are. It's you have the comparisons are extraordinary. I set out some of them in my article or my diary this week. You have a terrifying geopolitics, i.e., the possibility of a world war. You have economic instability. The indebtedness of the Western nations is very serious and can lead to a financial collapse. You have an incoming Labour government led by a leader who's switched from being on the left to the right, captured by a right-wing clique. That's what had happened to Ramsay MacDonald. You've got a chancellor who is the prisoner of austerity policies, just as Snowden was in 1929. And they're also tied to bankrupt and discredited orthodoxies. In their case, it's full Brexit. In Snowden's case, and MacDonald's, it was the gold standard. But they're trying to find ways to be, how should one say, agile or create growth, to use their language, without actually taking the necessary steps which would create that growth, because they're constrained by their own obsession with orthodoxies which no longer are relevant and actually are very destructive.
And in that analogy, obviously 1929 leads quite swiftly to the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War, and obviously the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, and then World War II. What are we seeing at the other side of the Atlantic? So, I mean, one of the things I was just saying to Hardeep, the great journalist, my friend, Carol Cadwalder, has gone for a week-long yoga retreat, and who could blame her? Because life is so turbulent. I was away over the weekend, it's Easter, I opened the social media, and a lot of stresses, kind of that feeling, comes back. Every day there's new atrocity in Honduras with prisoners from Trump, or, the universities getting attacked, or, bombing Houthis shared on a signal chat. The instability in the 20s and 30s obviously did originate originally in America with the stock market collapse, but rapidly impacted on Europe. How do you see this now? Britain is faced with this choice, as it were, with Brexit. It tore away from Europe, hit the high seas in an era where really naval mastery doesn't matter, and in a way pivoted towards America. And now and the Trump alliance with Johnson, or attempted deal. Now, you write a bit in your column about have all these accolades for Trump, and now what's that going to do for the people on the conservative right, maybe, or the reform right, who look to him for some kind of guidance?
Yes, if you look at the discourse which surrounded Trump's victory in November last year, you had the extreme right and the Conservative Party, which I think is actually, we should call it the extreme right now, because that's where they've got to. But generally speaking, welcoming Trump, i.e., you got two of the most formidable right-wing figures in Britain, far-right figures in Britain. That's Douglas Murray, the commentator, the polemicist, and Nigel Farage, actually going to Mar-a-Lago, weren't they? And they were the real sycophants to the new court of Trump. Kemi Basnok, who I think had been nervous about Trump, immediately celebrated him. That's the Tory leader, of course, her stalker now. I mean in the sense of the person who wants his job, Robert Jenrick, is a Trumpian. Large numbers of the far-right media went for Trump. If you read the Telegraph or the Mail, and of course, so did two former British prime ministers. It's so reckless because you just had to read what Trump said he was going to do, and of course, examine his record last time. It's a craven worship of power and abandonment of British values. I mean, Trump is a terrifying figure.
But to what end, Peter? I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, do the Conservative Party, I'm sure Reform does, but do the Conservative Party and others on the right actually think that sort of the Trumpian politics of Musk and the sort of the oligarchy could be brought here? I mean, consistently polls show that Musk and Trump are not popular figures here. You know, in many ways, we always discuss with our news team sort of this notion of unpopular populism, the sort of Rwanda scheme and the last gasps of that which was voted out of office. Why is the right here so drawn to a politics that seems so out of sync and unpopular with the voting public? What explains that?
The explanation is quite simple. There's a basic, because politics has changed so profoundly in the last 10, 15 years, political analysts try and explain what's happening by the old tools. You know, politicians want to be popular. Both the main political parties and the Reform Party, which is also are simply phenomena. They have been bought by money, by Mayfair, and of course also by international by donors, and that's who they answer to. They don't answer. They don't answer to the populace. They don't answer to, but they do. They are pursuing the agenda of donors, and the same applies to media. The major media in this country is offshore, and it's not answerable to. It's extraordinary because if you look at the major issues of our time, the majority of the British people want to have stronger ties with Europe and move towards reversing Brexit. But none of the media. You'd have thought that they wanted to be none of the political parties either. The major political parties, leaving aside the Greens or the Lib Dems, and likewise with Gaza. I mean, they've been a massive issue. Right from the start, the British public, large majority, clear majority, wanted a ceasefire, but neither of the political parties wanted that for a long time. And even now, you have them continuing to supporting a policy of arms and the sabotage of the great international institutions, which about the rule of law, etc. So there is a huge. This is the answer, I think, in one issue after another, is that the main political parties are not interested. They are now answerable to their big donors. And if you look at the Trump business, is one thing the Tories, but the tragedy is Starmer. He too is sort of pursuing the reform agenda. I just do not understand it. You know, he is much more answerable to those he perceives as reform donors than to people who want to move back to Europe and to have sensible mainstream economic policies. And I find this tragic, actually, in the case of some. I think the Tories have gone. They just are the voice for the extreme rich. But White Starmer feels he has to do the same, and there's this noxious creature called McSweeney, who is part of a far-right, in Labour terms, group. And as in this remarkable book, Get In, by the 2 Times columnists Scott Pogrund and Maguire, reveals that Angela Rayner wanted to do the very sensible thing and just put a cap on stop foreign donors, basically poisoning British politics. But Starmer allowed Lord Alley, the man who buys his suits and other stuff, to block it with the assent of McSweeney. So they Starmer, to my utter amazement, has, and it's tragic for him, it's tragic for the Labour Party, it's tragic for Britain, and it guarantees his failure in the long term, will not address the structural problem that British politics now belongs to the super rich, the billionaire class, which is what links it to Trump, because Trump is also a manifestation of the billionaire class.
Peter, could I just expand that a little bit? Because I completely agree with that analysis, and also explains why Liz Truss would come back Trump. Or why Boris Johnson would, because there's a very lucrative world of speaking dinners, the American Heritage Foundation. There's I remember right on, Boris Johnson got a £30,000 invite to speak at a hedge fund in New York.
He was a bit more than that.
Probably. A bit more than that, probably like 100,000. But and so in Nigel Farage, millions in earnings from all these outside things. And so follow the money is a very good clue to this. And America is a conduit for a lot of this money. But I just want to ask you a slightly wider thing. I'm reading Paul Kennedy's book on the rise and the fall of the British Navy. It's a rather wonderful book from 1977. And he points out that Britain was basically bust by 1926. After the First World War, it destroyed its global power, but it had all this land that it had to defend. And then by 1945, it's completely in hock to the Americans. So the British state, its nuclear deterrent to a certain extent, its air bases, a lot of its power has been intertwined with the US for 8 years now. So this problem, which is besetting the world's policeman becoming the world's gangster, it's certainly protection rackets. And do you think the British state can unravel itself from its Anglo-American roots, or is that institutionally, constitutionally, emotionally possible?
It's a very interesting question, because logically it must. And when people talk about the special relationship, which has always been rather cringe-making, but it does have a reality. It's that that Britain and America have the same foreign policy, and in particular intelligence gathering operations. It gives us much more. MI6 and the CIA. I mean,
NSA and GCHQ particularly.
Yes. And MI6 is in many ways a sort of subsidiary of the CIA, and that's how it's worked. And and there's been very strong foreign policy reasons for that. I'm not criticizing it, although I think it's led to utter catastrophes like Iraq, which basically destroyed MI6's global reputation in a way I don't think it fully appreciates. But even so, I could understand why that was, and it was a patriotic thing to do, this pragmatic assessment that we stand for the same values as the United States. But with Trump, I do wonder what's going on there, because Trump has set himself as the great attacker of the deep state. And I have no doubt the State Department and the CIA feels a sense of revulsion and horror at Trump.
If they kept their jobs like this.
Yeah, exactly. And so where does that leave our special relationship? If I was, it's particularly given what Trump has been doing, basically if you look at what he's been doing in foreign policy, abandoning Ukraine, giving a green light to the far right, in the fascist right, really now. I mean, the settler colonial project
turning
into
Las Vegas.
Yeah, exactly. And then also, it now looks very much like Trump he wants to enable or even take part in a U.S. attack on Iran. So which would, and now these are all things which the deep state would be against, as is, I think, Shin Bet and Mossad, by the way. I mean, you have this you have this situation where we have these out of control far right leaders, Trump, Netanyahu, and various others, Putin actually, and Modi, you would classify, who seem to be have learned the secret of power. Now, we always felt, from the comfort of our armchairs, in that ultimately the constitutional arrangements governing modern democracies stopped mad people taking over. But there's no question that a mad person with a very sinister project has taken over the United States. Now, at what point is somebody going to stop him? And maybe they've concluded they can't.
Constitutionally, only I think there's this section. There's a 25th Amendment that it seemed to be.
I like the sound of this 25th Amendment.
If he's mentally incompetent, but then JD Vance takes over, which is just the tech bros. It's just oligarchy.
So we have purchased by we are living in a world which has been captured by oligarchs, and it's all there in Greek history. Polybius just explained how you move this cycle from democracy to oligarchy to tyranny, and then back.
And that's why Plato thought a democracy would work, because the oligarchs would always take over.
Yeah, exactly. And he was right. And it's happened in front of our eyes.
To cheer us up, let's have another quick swing.
Definitely, I was just about to raise that.
Because this is supposed to be back chat, where we cheer ourselves. Oh,
yeah, you got a bit enthusiastic there.
I did. I put my point in it. Hardeep, how you doing with your point?
I'm okay.
I can do a nice little side pour that doesn't keep. But to cheer us up and look at other world figures who maybe leave a lesser stain on humanity, on eternity, but a rather more benign glow. You have a story about the recently deceased Pope, I believe, which I don't know.
Yes, I mean the Pope, who I think has been the greatest Pope of our lifetime, the greatest religious leader, certainly in the West, the Christian tradition of our time. It's what he can teach us about learning on the job. So when he was picked out very early on in Argentina as a future leader. And he became a senior bishop on the rise. And then there was a case where there was two libertarian priests who
Libertarian theology, liberation theology.
Liberation. I apologize.
No, libertarian is slightly different.
Quite right. And he disowned them. And this enabled them to fall. In other words, they lost the protection of the Catholic Church, and they were tortured and imprisoned. And he got a huge uproar about this. And so here you have the young Pope, the future Pope Francis, doing the job of the authoritarian fascist regime in Argentina. And he's punished by the Argentine church. He's sent off to a remote diocese where he spends many years, and it's a poor area. And there he learns what his true mission is not to please people in power, it's to serve the poor. And he comes back enormously strengthened, and that is what turns him into the fabulous, I think, Pope he became, the religious leader he became.
Well, what did you find so impressive about him while he was Pope? Just so people who don't follow these things.
I mean, can I just say that what the lesson we need to learn from this is that he very much confessed and admitted and acknowledged that he'd got something wrong.
Yeah.
And so if we look at one of the things which I think has gone awfully wrong in British public life is our leaders, people that feel, particularly politicians, feel unable to say, I've made a mistake.
And as though you blame Churchill a bit for this, never apologise, never explain.
I think, probably on the other hand, Churchill, I think, had a grandeur about him, which enabled him to not get away with mistakes, but to I made a mistake, to make mistakes and say so. Whereas, but nowadays, the there is a sort of pride attaching to political leaders, which means that it's a sign of weakness to apologize. Now, what you learn from the Pope's history is actually it's a sign of strength, and it's a sign of regeneration, and it's a sign of honesty, and his apologies for his grievous crime, really, when he was a young aspirant bishop. And I think that our leaders we all, in the media too, can learn from that, contemplating that experience. As Pope, as a result, he was the Pope who actually did the things which the Christian leader is supposed to do. He stood up for the oppressed, the poor. He did what Christ did during his 3 years on his 3-year mission, and of course towards the end of his time as Pope, he rang up, and I've been to this church. He rang up the Church of the Holy Family in Gaza, the priest. I knew the predecessors of the current priest, and he would learn about what is going on in Gaza that day, and then he would speak out about it. Now, it's very interesting. If you look at the coverage of the Pope's life, the BBC was very slow, to mention this. The Times didn't in its sort of obituaries. It's very anxious making for the pro-Israel press that the Pope, who is clearly one of the most significant popes in history, basically this was his final guidance to the world, that what Israel is doing.
To Christians as well as Muslim Palestinians. Like, there's a lot going on, isn't there? A lot of Palestinians, and the churches there that are being persecuted are Christian Palestinians.
Oh, yeah. Yes. There are about 600 Christians in Gaza.
Oh, is that all that's left?
Yeah, all that was left when I went there. The priest went through his congregation. And it had been falling, but there was a sustained Christian population, and they were doing most extraordinary things. The kind of social welfare work being carried out by nuns, disabled, mentally backward children and so on. I met the nuns there, and it was like talking. They were performing in the purest way the teachings of Jesus Christ, and to see them doing this, and this is why the attempts by Israel to smear Gaza as an Islamist place.
And isn't this the original PLO, Edward Said, the great writer of Orientalism, Helen Alawi, they were Christian Palestinians or Christian Coptic background, and somehow the Hamas PLO, the Fatah separation has allowed the conflation of Muslim and Palestinian.
If you look at the history here, many of the early nationalist leaders or resistance leaders, one of whom was, the intellectual behind that was Edward Said, but they were actually Christians. And of course, one of the ways, if you look at the history of Hamas, it was engineered in many ways by the CIA,
particularly Mossad,
and Mossad, in order to undermine the Christian nationalist secular leadership. But that is certainly right.
So I want to bring Hardeep back in here just on this, because I didn't realize this thing about Francis admitting his errors. You wrote a lovely piece about football and Gareth Southgate. And, there's all this controversy around adolescence and the manosphere. That's a similar lesson, Hardeep, isn't it, what Peter's saying? The men aren't allowed anymore to admit failure. And that's kind of Southgate's great lesson.
Yeah. I mean, I've written about this in the last few print editions. So I picked up this very point a couple of editions back when there was the Channel 4 two-part drama series called Brian and Maggie, which is a dramatization of the very famous interview that took place between Brian Walden and Margaret Thatcher just after the Nigel Lawson, who was then the Chancellor, his resignation. And he was consistently asking her, do you think you could have kept Lawson in place if you had just, made a compromise on your advisor on finance, and he kept asking her the question, and eventually she said, "I don't know." And I really used that, and I wasn't alive. Well, I was very young, I think, when this interview took place, so I wasn't alive. So I only really saw it when this drama came out starring Stephen Coogan. And that's the bit I picked up on from watching the drama. And I wrote this piece, which was this very thing, which these days, which politician would ever say, "I don't know"? And actually, even Thatcher did it. Even Thatcher did. And apparently that was a seminal moment where, even she couldn't, she had doubt. And then I picked up the theme again in this month's print edition, because Gareth Southgate recently delivered the BBC's Richard Dimbleby lecture. And he used the considerable platform to talk about many things. I mean, to read the headlines after that speech, you think it was just about the manosphere and toxic online misogyny, but it's actually bigger than that as well. And it was very wise and human. And Gareth Southgate is a really interesting figure, because in our public life and culturally, because he's special because he's so ordinary.
And he missed that penalty.
Yeah, so because of the journey he's been on in front of our eyes, I remember sitting there with my family, Euro 96, and he missed that penalty, and it's just awful seeing him at the end on the pitch on his own, and he's looking down, his hands are cradling his head. And then another image, which was just from a few years ago, when England got to the finals of Euro 2020. And a number of players, including Bukayo Saka, missed a penalty. And you had this beautiful moment, I thought, where Gareth Southgate was cradling Saka at the end of the match. And I really wanted to use those two images. And so what Southgate was saying was the way to build up belief and resilience in young people today, including and especially young boys and men, is we need to be able to be really human in how we fail, and see that failure and setbacks are part of what makes us more resilient, what makes us human. And so really his speech wasn't just about sort of Andrew Tate and all these things he didn't mention. I mean, he should and could have mentioned more to do with, the patriarchal society we live in, the misogyny. But really what he was saying was, we need to question the values that we prioritize in our society, which includes politics and culture and the leadership in those areas. We need to question why it is that we're not seeing ourselves first and foremost as humans with needs, the need to connect, the need to be recognized, the need to fail and learn how to do that in a way that your self-worth is recoverable. And so really and I really liked that, because it was one of those rare moments, I think, in public life where you have a conversation which is really philosophical and really human. I don't think we find that much at all, if at all, to be honest, in politics or journalism.
If you go back to Maggie Thatcher, which was where we were starting here, you look at her interviews, and the reason why she worked, forgetting what she did, right, with lots of people hate her and so on, is that she knew where she was, she knew who she was. And so when an interviewer chucked her a question, because she'd thought about who she was and what she believed in, she came up with a genuine answer. Now, if you compare that to every politician since Blair onwards, they would pull, their answer would not be genuine. It would have been worked out with a focus group. And, Mrs. Clinton, for instance, when she was running for office, it took about 14 hours to react to anything, because she'd have a meeting of advisors, they'd poll it, and eventually she'd come up with a lot of long words and then utterly meaningless. And so this is what I think the tragedy with Starmer. He doesn't really know who he is. And this makes it a real problem, because he has to go and take advice, and he's decided to delegate these decisions to this 40-year-old advisor with no experience of real life, this man McSweeney, who's a polling person and he's a political strategist. But he doesn't, but Starmer himself doesn't know where, and this is why he's got in a muddle now with this trans issue, because he's all over he's not, doesn't have a view, he just subcontracts his view to his political strategist. And this is no use.
So do you think Nigel Farage, for instance, does know who he is? It's a very interesting thing. Why is Farage successful? Because he does come over. He's a bloke in the pub who makes sense and knows a bit, and yes, he comes over much more
much better than Sama, who's a dead loss, or Bazanov likewise. And she seems to take her political views by following the Twitter feed of Elon Musk, and we haven't had a politician who has challenged this methodology that you go into politics in order just simply to say the right things in order to succeed. I've just been reading a slim volume of Betjeman's poetry, John, and he's got this wonderful line. Actually, it's over there in the bag. I might read you that. Ask you if I should pull it out. He says to approve of the things which everyone approves of is very easy. Well, yeah. So you find an area where the world at any one moment agrees on, and the politician sees their job. Can we pause this? I'm going to read it out. Actually, it's very good. Now, thank you.
To prove what everybody approves of. That's very good. Sorry.
Yeah, you know, these are wonderful poems. I discovered these.
Oh, it's a great volume.
There's a slim volume. I discovered this book in a second-hand bookshop.
Which is always the best.
Yeah, no, actually, I might have been.
I can still smell that old paper where the pages are falling apart.
Yeah. And I mean, I think
pages are coming apart.
Yeah,
right in front of us. Yeah.
It's actually a poem here, which they're wonderful poems. They make you cry. And this one's the arrest of Oscar Wilde at the Cadogan Hotel.
Right.
And so I just read out this, and it's Oscar's voice as the police are coming up the stairs. And it says, and this is one of the, it says, so you've brought me the latest yellow book, and Buchan has got in it now. Approval of what is approved of is as false as a well-kept vow, and so on. I mean, it's very, I mean, yes, and you see that phrase, that is what politicians now, they're their desperate, pathetic attempt to go along with the consensus. And so with Sama on this trans thing, which he should never have allowed to become an issue about him at all, it starts off, he thinks, right, I'm with the sort of trans community. And that's a very honourable position. And then he gets an awful lot of flack, and the Mail and the Spectator, etc., go bonkers. And then you think, phew, we've got a Supreme Court ruling. And then he can change his mind, but then it's not enough. And he's captured. And he's not a... and so
I think it's interesting because often what we're describing, the label that's given to this, what we're discussing, is authenticity, and that being important. But I think that actually masks the deeper issue, which is the lack of belief. And I think what I mean by that is politics today seems devoid of
Trump is authentic.
real belief.
Trump is authentic.
And
Trump
these
is
things are
authentically
different
bonkers
things.
and right-wing.
But they're different. But what does he believe?
If you want authenticity in principle.
But people keep saying we want authenticity from our politicians. Farage has some semblance of that. But that is that always is being used without going deeper into what does that really mean. And what it means is, what do these people really believe in? And all they ever say is, I don't think the British public cares about X. I think the British public wants to hear about this. I mean, it's so transparent. It's even that as a linguistic device, that you ask a politician a question, they start saying, I don't think the public wants to hear about this. It's so bizarre, really, to think of it. But I think it's a deeper problem, which, again, no one has a clue what to do about, because it's something that's happened over time, and it's about forces around us as much as anything else, maybe.
So one way I could just follow this a bit further is that, being a bit older than Hardeep and saying, remember
Older and wiser.
No, just older. No, not wiser. Wider. Older and wider.
Wider.
Actually, and this is a quite open question, that what is bigger than the sort of flux, the flummox, or whatever, the foam of the personality on top, originally was the political parties. I remember people saying Labour's lost millions in 1983, Eric Osborne, they'll never be re-elected, and then you had Kinnock, and then you had Blair and that the transitory expression of that vote is that prime minister. But we're not a presidential system. And I'm quite amazed by the powers, by the way, that Trump has, which he could do, dismiss people. No British prime minister could do. But is that era over? Because what Peter Kellner writes in Prospect, and I think we have Neil Lawson writes today on Byline Times, is that actually the two-party system is dead. It's slightly distorted by moments of crisis like COVID or Brexit and repolarizing it. But actually consistently polling, something like 70% of the people used to vote for one of the two parties, or 90%, 70%. Now it's less than 50. And that what I expect is the party to replace the leader. The party to keep on replacing the leader. The values of the party are more important than what Keir Starmer says. Is that true anymore? If those parties, the values are really more about the donors and about the celebrity value of the authenticity.
I think that's the point that links back to Peter's point about they're captured by donations or status or money of a different kind, which is not really to do with the public. And
that the public's loyalty is not to a party, it's to, or an ideology, it's to...
What's happened, and it's something which the British Constitution, the informal British Constitution, isn't really prepared for, is the emergence of celebrity politics. The British political system, as it emerged in the 19th century, is based on political parties and also the idea of public service. And so the style of a prime minister, which was created actually by the Duke of Wellington after Waterloo, was this very sub-fusk. It's about others, not myself. I don't boast. I give out. My job is really to keep everybody on the road and discipline anybody who falls out. Hal Wilson said this when he adopted this. He was a trained civil servant, but he's exactly what he did. He said it's the easiest job in the world, being prime minister, because the other people do the work. They run the departments. And my job really is to sort them out if they go wrong and sack them and bring in somebody else. Otherwise, it's a very easy job. That's what Wilson explained it. And this is and what we have, I think it is the rise of TV, really, and media has changed this. First of all, because it meant that the Britain moves steadily towards the US system, which is of a presidential. Thatcher did this unconsciously. She didn't mean it, but because she was the first woman prime minister, and she did tower over her cabinet, it sort of happened with her without her meaning to. Then Blair consciously took it on. He created himself as a celebrity. And the Diana moment, was when he personalized politics. Suddenly you're interested in the politician's family and all the circumstances which surround them. And all subsequent figures have sought to do the same as Blair. And it's including, in a rather tragic way, Starmer, who would fit in much better and I think that in the old-fashioned pre-Blairite political system. And there's a lot to be said for the pre-Blairite political. Basically, that's how Britain is meant to work. Farage has been able to flourish and create, basically the reform is Farage backed by very significant donors who we don't really understand who they are, and an agenda who we don't know what it is. And it requires the existence of a client media which isn't going to ask him difficult or troubling questions. And of course Farage has this because he has basically the mainstream media.
When you say this, what comes to mind is something I've been saying in my recent writing on this, which is politics isn't about politics anymore. And I actually think that same sentiment applies to journalism. Journalism isn't journalism anymore. And the reason I say that is because there's also been a change, everything from GB News to the YouTube bros and the kind of shows they're making.
To Tommy Robinson saying, we are the media.
We are the media now. They're
Tommy Robinson.
The sort of this notion that what journalism, and it's happened incrementally and social media has affected it, but also, broadcast 24/7, the personalization of the journalist and sort of.
And Michelle Hussein was talking about this. It's very interesting.
Happened, hasn't it?
She gave this interview disgraceful that the BBC should have allowed her to go, because they clearly weren't going to promote her. Gaza was part of it, but not the only reason. And she was talking, well, if you listened to a Michelle Hussein interview, it was nothing about her. She was just, it was purely about the issue and subject.
Never use the words I ever.
And if you look at the two people who are dominant now, all three really, Nick Robinson, Amal Rajan, and Emma Barnett, it's the me thing. It's the media person as a personality projecting themselves. And so what you've had is, and this is a central, and it's another modern problem, is the fusion of the media and political class. And saying Michael Gove walks out of the cabinet and becomes political editor.
What's Liz Truss doing next? She's setting up a TV company, a media company.
Yeah, GB News is not really a media company. It's a political, a tool for political influence. People keep on saying it's losing money. That's what it's for. The money is being spent to shape political events. It's a great success. It's not there to. It isn't a business proposition at all. It's there to change the society we're living in and make it nastier, crueler. And in the way that Byline Times is one of the reasons why Byline Times is so important is that Byline Times exposes these hideous agendas, these culture wars, which are meant to turn people, destroy society, turn us against.
But to the public, and relatives of mine who have it on in the background don't agree with what is said on it, but that it's journalism. I guess that's what I'm saying, isn't it? So we know what how politics isn't about politics in the traditional pre-Blair sense anymore, and journalism. Tommy Robinson, how can he be a media figure? But I think my concern is that the person on the street, GB News, calls itself journalism. It must be journalism, and
It's not Ofcom license.
It's daunting, isn't it? This is part of the problem, isn't it? That both in politics and in the media, there is a hollowness which has been filled with, it seems, personality, entertainment.
It's so confusing, isn't it? Because I remember people talking about during Leveson, during the Leveson inquiry about should you professionalise journalism? No, free speech was kind of right. But there's a huge distinction. I mean, Jones would admit to this. He doesn't consider himself a journalist. He considers himself an activist rather than a reporter. But Michael Gove and Boris Johnson will describe themselves, along with Tommy Robinson, and people like Dan Warden, as journalists. And in a way, if I turned up in law, I've tried to exercise, and hadn't passed the bar exam, or I suppose, or even, done my pupillage and started practicing law on the basis that I thought I knew what was right and wrong. And it's everybody's a journalist now.
But what is it about these two professions, as Peter says, media and politics? I mean, is it just because purely they are public, they're in public life? If you're a politician or a journalist, you're in public life. And therefore, this corruption of both of these professions has happened, and it's now much more personality driven. But it's curious, isn't it? Because like you say, the other professions, like being a doctor or a lawyer, you can never start saying, I'm a lawyer too now, or I'm the real lawyer.
I'm the brain surgeon.
But the lefty lawyers, that thing about lefty lawyers sort of ruining our country. It's that sort of, again, that sort of criticism of certain professions and a distortion around the meaning of what these professions are. But it's something that I often think of, and that's why I have, some existential doubt about politics and journalism.
What is journalism for? Peter, can I just ask you a question as the focus? So we better close, because we love talking like this, but you may have a life to get on with, and we might need to eat. But
I mustn't drink too much before we finish.
No, we're not. We're nearly finished. So I've only recently become a journalist in the autumn of my life, it's like 12 years ago. And I used to say to people, what are you? Oh, I write, I write culture magazines, I write drama for TV, I write stage drama. Everybody was fine and asked me questions. And I wanted this same to a politician. As soon as I say I'm a journalist, go, what? Oh, you're not going to write about this. People get scared. Saying you're a journalist is a bit like saying, well, I am a assassin for the SAS. It has a weird kudos. And I wonder if politicians get that same alienating frisson from the members of the public. Whenever you say you're a journalist, go, well, there's a kind of awe and fear. With actors, it's awe, right? There's no fear. But with a journalist, it's like, oh, that's interesting. You can ruin my life.
Yeah, Max Weber was very interesting on this, about how a journalist would go to a party and everybody would ingratiate themselves with him, and then he would leave and they would all say, what a complete... Yeah, you are a pariah at the same time as being very welcomed.
Yeah.
But what I think, but Weber was writing at a time when journalists there was a distinction between the two classes, and I think now there isn't really. You can see this from Johnson, because he was a Telegraph columnist, becomes Prime Minister. Now he's a Mail columnist. Gove saunters in from the Times, wasn't it?
Yeah, big friend.
Yeah, where he interviews Donald Trump in the White House with Murdoch as an unseen presence.
Great favourite now, and now he's Paul Marshall's favourite because he's taken over the Spectator.
And then Paul Marshall gives him the Spectator. So they're interchangeable, and your meal ticket afterwards. It's all kinds of reasons why it corrupts. And of course, you form relations on the basis that it will continue after you're in office, because you'll be wanting that gig as well, and it may even be a handover. And of course, your family comes in. If you look at the Johnson, it becomes a sort of family concern as well. So journalism has simply become Chomsky was so right in his analysis that journalism is just a manifestation of power. And that is how you get on in journalism. And you can see that very clearly again and again. It is not about holding power to account.
So how do you live with being a journalist? And I'm asking this it's more to do with me than you.
I think you as Pope Francis.
How do you hold that in your head and still do the work you do, Peter?
Well, yes, you can stick to the original concept or the noble concept of journalism. You're holding power to account, you're telling the truth, you're exposing embarrassing stories, etc. And actually, Byline Times does that. We are a relatively small circulation. There's therefore no money in it. And I think the way you do it, but you have to realize that journalism is no longer a profession with which you can buy a house or educate your children privately, certainly not, or go on holiday even. It should be seen as a vocation. You're never going to be making more than £25,000 a year or £30,000 a year, but you can tell the truth. And that is, so I think it's a bit like being a scholar in its purest sense.
Or a vicar.
Or a vicar, or just something like that. And don't think, so what we are, we still live in a world where, you have these big name journalists and big papers, they'll be paying people several £100,000 a year, millions occasionally. Johnson is said to be on something just short of $1 million, whether that's still the case. And then once you go over about £50,000 a year, you're somehow bored.
That's good.
And that's it. And I think you have to realise that maybe that also applies in other forms of life. If there's a doctor you're getting paid too well, you may have to ask yourself why. Or certainly as a lawyer, who are you acting for?
But I do agree with you, Peter, that just because what that is happening to the industry around us doesn't mean that should stop us from being motivated.
No, it gives us a wonderful opportunity. Byline Times has a wonderful opportunity. And I write also for Middle East Eye, it's the same, or for Declassified. It's quite incredible. It's telling the only website which has really told the truth about the British military and intelligence gathering.
Akateria, the base.
Yeah, it's incredibly important work, and that is a very small organisation with half a dozen people, which will be hailed by future generations. You may not be making, and it's extraordinary that the BBC doesn't choose to bring on Matt Kennard and Curtis and the other people doing this amazing work, because they should. These are real. They're doing the job of journalism, as we are. We've done amazing investigations.
Yeah.
And
but even though investigative journalism can't didn't stop Trump from being seen as a viable candidate for the presidency a second time and becoming president, that shouldn't weigh on us too much. Do you see why the dilemma I'm posing here?
Well, there isn't a dilemma. Once you've understood what contemporary mainstream journalism is, that it's a way of exercising power. I'll give you an example of Middle East Eye last week. It was quite extraordinary business. We have a bright young reporter got hold of the story that Gideon Saar, the Israeli foreign minister, was coming to London. He wrote it. Not one mainstream paper followed it up. He arrives. He goes to see the foreign secretary. Now, there's lots of reasons why that's a story. You know, Israel's involved in this war on Gaza. It hasn't, it's blocked all aid for 50 days. People are starving to death now. We're getting more and more reports. Israel smashed the ceasefire agreement with Hamas. It may well bomb Iran quite soon. And yet and I can see also why the Foreign Office didn't want to put out a press release, because they don't want to be asked about all of this and what are at. But Middle East Eye broke it. Everybody would have read it, and the papers just, apart from, give them credit, The Guardian after about a day and a half. Now, this is the British media collaborating, becoming part of the British government. It's part of, and its project to support the Israeli assault on Gaza. And
so when you've got the book coming out, you've been to the West Bank regularly, and you've been to Gaza, you've been there involved in 20 years. I think I'm going to redirect, just to close Hardeep's point, So I think there's an answer, which isn't despair. But given you advocated for this, why? What was the point? Why?
Yeah, good question. Maybe we are just whistling in the wind. And certainly I can see that we haven't had serious policy changes as a result of our work. But I think we do shape future generations. There's a very good book, isn't there? There's A.J.P. Taylor's masterpiece, The Troublemakers. The people who tell the truth, they may be despised, when they're doing it. And often actually we're seeing, people being arrested, our colleagues being arrested. But of course the mainstream papers aren't interested. That Asa Winstanley and others are sort of find that they're being, who make a noise about Palestine as they knock on their door. I don't think he got arrested, Asa, but I think they went through his papers and his things and others. And so there are real sacrifices that our colleagues are making, and the slaughter of Palestinian journalists.
Another one.
I mean, I think according to Reporters Without Borders, it's about 170 are being killed. They're being targeted.
Amazing one this weekend who said, predicted her own death, who said, make it loud, and they killed the family.
And yet this is not a matter for the British papers, whereas Alison Pearson had a knock on her door because
she did promote far-right racist incendiary nonsense.
I don't want to go on about what she said, but the fact was this was a front-page splash on the Telegraph for days on end.
Yeah, that's right.
And
persecution of journalists.
This was a persecution of. I checked. The Telegraph hasn't written a damn thing about the slaughter of Palestinian journalists.
Went back to the assassination of that great CNN correspondent with a sniper bullet. That was 2 years ago, wasn't it?
Are you talking about Shireen Abu Akleh?
Yeah. You wrote about that for us, I think.
I'm sure I did. I mean, that's a very terrible episode where it is very telling because you can go to where Shireen was shot. You can look at where she was shot from. There's clearly she was assassinated. Israeli press lied. The Israeli IDF lied about it. And eventually I don't think they've ever fully admitted responsibility for it. Then, of course, she was jostled and a funeral. And I went to her memorial service effectively in St. Bride's a few months later. It's put on by pro-Palestinian activists. It was a very unbelievably moving service. And there was nobody from the BBC, nobody from somebody from Al Jazeera. She was an Al Jazeera, not CNN.
Oh, right, sorry. She had been at CNN.
She may well. She's an American citizen, but there's nobody. The mainstream press basically wasn't represented at Shireen's London funeral, and you really have to worry about the morality of British journalists who are happy to expound at great length and in the comfort of a studio like this for large sums of money in support of what Israel is doing, and they won't stand up for these astonishingly brave people who've in many cases paid with their lives for bringing to the world the stories and the photography and the images of the horror which is going on.
And to that level, we must say they have succeeded. World opinion has not been persuaded by this suppression that she's by. And I'm right, just to conclude.
And so you can say, therefore, to go back to the point we were making, I think that that is an achievement, isn't it?
Yeah. Well,
I think what I've really gotten from this conversation, Peter, is, journalism as an extension of power. And the other reason, we started this show tonight with looking at the latest print edition, The Simmer of Discontent. And the other reason I really wanted to look back at last summer's riots and look at the lack of a government response to them is because I think in about January, in the January edition, we printed an article by Josiah Mortimer, our chief reporter, and he had been passed by some sources within the Reform sort of community Facebook groups who had got hold of two photographs in which Nigel Farage was pictured with a group of people who were identified by our reporting as far-right activists, including one person next to Farage, who is a regional manager for Reform in one of its areas. And the captions with these photos were, we just had a great day out in London with Nigel before his show.
So they're in an office. They're in
an office.
Looks like Reform headquarters.
And we again can't confirm the location. And of course, Josiah asked for Reform to explain these photos. They didn't reply. They don't reply. Our reporters are not allowed to go to any press conferences. They're barred from all of them with regards to Reform. And so we got no answer. So we published this article and the pictures are there. And obviously we never would have published the pictures if there was any question of their authenticity. And not one outlet, established media outlet, followed up on that. Not one. And I really think it's not about Byline Times getting credit for anything. It's just more that The Guardian, The Independent, The Times have more resources than a small organization like us. And if they contacted Nigel Farage, he would have to reply to them. And so the other reason I wanted to do the Simmer of Discontent is because we have no answers and no mechanism to force answers, and the media silence is a part of the story. And it was really interesting. The day after this edition went to print, I had a very vivid, I call it a dream, but it was sort of a nightmare, of like riots and fire in my head, and I was sort of part of them, and not instigating them. I was there, not reporting on them, like sort of they were around me. And I woke up and I just thought that was, I'm quite interested in Carl Jung and the psyche and all that sort of thing. But yeah.
You think they're going to happen? But how do you mind?
I just think this.
But you have been, it's not just Carl Jung, it's Sigmund Freud and repression. You lived opposite the BNP headquarters as a young girl when there were riots outside.
Yeah, I mean, people have had it far, 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 far worse. But yeah, that viscerality, and I think I do question the journalists who are sitting in the established press. I mean, it's very distant from them, isn't it? The consequences of these sort of things. Yeah. But I do agree with Peter that actually the work we do at Byline Times is extremely important, because one of our core missions is to look at journalism as an extension of power.
Yeah.
One optimistic, and we better close this now.
I try reading a poem. Will I be able to hear that?
Can you read a poem? Before you do, I'm going to mention another poet. And we're going to end on I think we should have this every week.
Peters and the
Peter Oborne.
The Peters
on the chair, Evening with a cocoa and a poem. But before I say that, was one thing I get from both of you reminds me of what the famous Russian poet Anna Akhmatova said. She was a brilliant surrealist poet. During the Stalin purges, both her husband and her son were imprisoned. I think both subsequently died. And she would wait outside the Lubyanka, which is the KGB headquarters in Moscow, with all these other women in black, waiting for news. And they said, it's very moving, "Can you bear witness to this?" And she said, "I can."
Yes, bearing witness. Now, this is in memorial. Walter Ramsden died 26th of March, 1947, Pembroke College, Oxford. Dr. Ramsden cannot read the Times obituary today. He's dead. Let monograms on silkworms by other people be thrown away, unread. For he who best could understand and criticize them, he lies clay in bed. The body waits in Pembroke College, where the ivy taps the panes all night. That old head so full of knowledge, that good heart that kept the brains all right, those old cheeks that faintly flushed as the port suffused the veins, drained white. Crocus in the fellow's garden, winter jasmine up the wall gleam gold. Shadows of Victorian chimneys on the sunny grass plot fall long, cold. Master, bursar, senior tutor, these, his 3 survivors, all feel old. They remember as the coffin to its final obsequations leaves the gates, buzz of bees in window boxes on their summer ministrations, kitchen din, cups and plates, and the getting of bumped suppers for the long-dead generations coming in from 8s. It's not a great poem, but it's sort of very evocative, isn't it? It's wonderfully done.
And on that note, please do join us next month for our Byline Back Chat, and we'll have more poems and more chat. And do, if you don't already do, subscribe to Byline Times. That's the only way we keep going. This is our major project that funds all our journalists. You can subscribe at bylinetimes.com, and we will soon have news of a way of subscribing to an easier digital edition. But meanwhile, cheerio, and see you next month.